After talking about the digital circus, somebody asked me, do I apply this same critical eye to my own content? And the answer is yeah, absolutely. In fact, I've talked multiple times about how I never really connect with Rainbow Dash Presents or any of our past material on quite the same level that our fans do. Because every time I go back and I look at my own stuff, it's hard not to think about the mistakes and, oh, was that a good line read? And, oh, what could I have done differently? In fact, when I have the most fun with our own stuff, it's seeing it through somebody else's eyes. So for example, there's a music artist who goes by Koa, and she did these songs that were based on Rainbow Dash Presents, and that was something I was able to enjoy a lot, because there was like this degree of separation where I wasn't worried about whether or not I did these good line reads. I could just kind of enjoy the music that she wrote. But at any rate, though, this is not just bullying. I don't just watch, like, Monkey Wrench and The Amazing Digital Circus and then specifically, target them and try to pick them apart. I do this with my own stuff. So somebody did say, kicking over that sandcastle is a lot easier to do than making things. And that is very, very true. Because making stuff, it's never just one thing that you're worried about. You've got usually a lot of different things. If you're the only person on the project, then you really only have to worry about yourself, but then unfortunately you're going to bring all your weaknesses to the table. Then you're going to find you're also constrained by your environment. So for example, YouTube, it's a corporate monopoly, we don't have hardly any choices at all, and the company's not competing to find good entertainment. Like, they don't care if people are having fun on YouTube, they just care if people are watching it. So they create this ecosystem that's based around engagement and repeat viewership and whatever, and it's like a lot of pressure. You get this mentality that I just have to make things and it doesn't matter if it's really at its peak, you just gotta make it because there's gotta be more that comes out soon afterward, or otherwise you're not gonna do as well because of all this algorithmic stuff. There's also a lot of rules. It boxes you in on the amount of exploration that you can do. I mean, a variety channel is one of the best ways to kill your viewership, because if you're doing a lot of different things, the algorithm has a harder time zeroing in on who your audience is. And that's one of the reasons why my channel, although it says it has 180,000 subscribers, it's kind of dead because those are like My Little Pony subscribers. And then the system, it's always trying to find more My Little Pony subscribers for whatever I make, and then they don't care about, D&D or whatever. The point is, really, here, that there's a difference between a successful project versus maybe a good project, and that alone is going to change a lot of your math and calculations. Because after all, can we not be stupid, please? Like, when you make things, you want people to see the things that you make. Like, creating for the joy of creation is fine, but then if that's why you're why are you uploading to the internet? So other people can see it and find it and share your joy. Right? Screaming into the void sucks! We don't upload to the internet just for the joy of screaming into the blackness. But I've talked about this before. The reason why I bring it up here is because it does play into your creative team discussions and things like that. Everybody wants their work to be seen. Like when you've got a creative team of, let's say, even 3 people, usually all 3 of those artists are hoping that their hard work will be seen by people. Because hey, if you're gonna make things for passion, then typically you want it to be a good product that lots of people see, and they say, yeah, this was really cool, you guys are really cool. Or, if it's gonna suck and be super corporate, you'd like it to make a lot of money so that it's worth selling out for. The worst thing you could do is make a really crappy corporate product that's just fishing for algorithmic engagement, and then have it fail and make no money. Because at that point, you're just making something everybody hates for no benefit to anyone. This isn't just hypothetical. I've been involved in other projects, and this is an argument that I've been in. But that aside, the question that was posed to me is, have I ever really, looked at Jim of the Romantic Journey, for example, and gutted it the same way that I will tear apart The Amazing Digital Circus? And oh boy, have we dissected the Jim of the Romantic Journey on an internal level. So one of the first things with that is that we did have production issues with it that went beyond just the writing. No one was really making money off of it at that time. That is, we were kind of hoping that it would take off and grow, but ever since Google switched over to kind of its long-form engagement-driven metrics, most things just decline in viewership, so that was another thing that just was declining in viewership. So pretty much everything that was done on more or less just a volunteer level. Like, there wasn't hardly any money in it. The hope was just that people would see it and think it was cool, and then maybe it would get big enough that there could be money in it. It didn't take long before the animators started cutting lines while they were doing the animation so that there would be less animation to do, and, it was basically volunteer work, so it's like, what are you gonna get upset about that? So that made things a little bit messier. One of the best examples was that we had this running joke in one episode where all the characters were supposed to keep saying, oh, it's combat, it's supposed to be dangerous, as justification for something stupid they were doing. And then, because of the cutting, it stopped being a running joke and it was lost. And you can even, if you listen to that episode, there's a scene where Del goes, it's combat, and it's like really awkward. It's because that whole line was cut. And like, I mean, like that happened, but also we were trying to get stuff out as fast as possible because we were fighting a hostile algorithmic ecosystem. There's a rule in creativity where you can get things that are fast, cheap, or good, and you have to pick two. You can't get all three. Google doesn't know how things are made, as far as I can tell. It's all just marketing managers, so they don't care, they don't have any idea what's going on. We just deal with it. Jim of the Romantic Journey was cheap and fast, and it wasn't always good as a result. When you look at something like Monkey Wrench, you can see that it's very expensive. And I think that the reason why Google likes this setup is because Google doesn't have to take any of the risks. So some people are willing to invest the money to get expensive and good, or at least they hope for good. They definitely get expensive. And then if it doesn't do well, the distributor doesn't care. They have a monopoly that doesn't matter to them. We're all kind of getting scammed by this system, and that's why personally I will often recommend cheap as being one of the things that you choose, because you don't know if you're going to make the money back, and your distributor doesn't care. So anyway, though, with the writing, with Jim of the Romantic Journey, I was way over ambitious. We had like a half dozen characters, and only 5 minutes in each episode to convey anything. I also hadn't really put a lot of consideration into specifically what the characters were bringing to each other. Like, what are the conflicts and stories we can tell between Nico and Alexis, for example? I hadn't really worked that out. I knew who the characters were, and could do character stuff with them, but hadn't really figured out where the show aspect comes in. The way I was thinking about it was all kind of from the perspective of Del, who you can tell is really kind of the main character of the series. The joke of the series was that you had this character, Del, who was like a killer, who really appreciated the art of destruction, and they were trying to teach all these kids how to murder people, even though the kids were incompetent and didn't really want to murder people. And so just as a concept, that could be fun, but I mean, like, where is the show? Where was I going with it? I'd more or less set up a premise that would work well in a Sunday funny paper kind of thing, where like every weekend we see the antics of Del and the kids. But instead of every weekend, it was only as quickly as we could make this cartoon, which is phenomenally more expensive than a Sunday funny paper. And even in that case, though, I didn't really give that clear of a reason why you would want to see the next episode. Like in the first episode, Del shoots a kid's dog. And so are you supposed to be rooting for Del? Like, is Del actually the hero? What are we doing from here? Why tune into the next episode? I was taking this gardener approach to the whole thing. I was thinking that stuff would kind of grow up out of it organically, and it would be fine. If we just kept making stuff, then people would become interested in the characters, we would maybe grow it, and that was dumb. I mean, we released a bunch of stuff in a fairly short amount of time, but we got cheap and fast, and we didn't really get good. So one of the things that I took away from that was I really didn't display a good sense of structure or responsibility with time. What I realized is I don't think I would advocate again for cheap and fast. Cheap, I think you need to keep, but fast, not so much. It's a much better idea to take your time, develop an outline, and say, this is going to be the plot, and this is going to be what I'm driving at. So with our current thing I'm doing now, I'm mostly focusing on podcasts, and it's based on role-playing games. But with that, there's actually a couple different layers of developing a story and the characters. So first I developed a role-playing game, and that takes some time. I create a bunch of characters and these scenarios and the setting and everything, and then I let my players run through it. This winds up being almost an editorial process because your players ask questions about the setting and what's going on. They're like, can I do this? Or why has this not happened? Or you see who they get attached to and who they don't get attached to. Then when I finally do the podcast, it's not the actual game that was played. It is based on the game that was played, but it's like a second draft. The players did the first draft, we saw kind of what worked and what didn't, we throw out some of the stuff that didn't work, and then we have a story based on what I think worked about the game. I think it's an elegant and fun way to approach storytelling, and it's also relatively cheap because it doesn't cost me a lot to do role-playing games or to do a podcast. But if you ask me to do something more expensive, I think I would say the same approach is still a good idea. You should sit down and make a draft, and then a second draft, and then a third draft, and spend a good amount of time picking apart your script and throwing out elements that maybe aren't interesting or don't need to be there. Just tighten it up as much as possible. So for example, in one thing that I was involved in, I sat down and I started writing out a bunch of details about the setting, which were never ever going to hit the screen. For example, there was this nation that was supposed to be relatively warlike, so I was writing sort of a warlike mythology into their background. I had this whole scene where these two queens get in a fight, and then one queen strangles the other one with their hair. It's because the second queen, it was like, she had beautiful hair. And the gist of it was that, okay, so the people, they all wear their hair short, or wearing your hair long is shown as a sign of hubris. And part of that was that they fought a lot, so it was just practical, and it was good for things like lice, you're in military bunkers all the time. But also it was just good mythology, so if we ever wanted to find out about it, we could have. This was never going to be talked about, I wasn't going to have exposition about it, but I wrote it all because one of the stories was going to be about meeting a person from this nation. If this person's first instinct was going to be to stab people, I wanted to be able to say, why? Like, what were they raised on as a kid that makes them think like this? Now, what I'm describing, it can be very navel-gazing. So what you need to understand is how really irrelevant to an episode this was going to be. It had nothing to do with the main story. It was genuinely just me trying to ground a society so that I knew when we were like, they're warlike, I would just know why they were warlike. It was like, who does this? Why? The episodes were actually supposed to be character-driven, and so what it was going to be is they were going to go to this city, the warlike city, and they were going to be treated like royalty. Then the plot was going to be about, personal isolation and what is actual adoration. Like, one of the characters was going to kind of crush on one of the women from that nation, and it wasn't really going to be reciprocated, but then he had an AI girlfriend that was basically built into his wristwatch, and he could talk to her, and she would show affection, but only because she knew that's what he wanted. So this character, he would take an interest in this woman, and the only reason they were being treated like royalty was because they had the ability to order a package of steel. And this was kind of a primitive society, so getting access to good steel was incredibly valuable to them. And of course, everybody in this society assumes that our heroes know this, but our heroes are kind of oblivious to it. And so we would have this personal conflict where it's like, oh, I want to be loved, I want to be appreciated, but it doesn't feel like I'm really receiving that. And I wanted to be in the head of the woman who was rejecting him. Like, she's raised on this proud tradition of martial history, and like, oh, cut your hair because otherwise you could be strangled. Yet here she has to be nice to this kind of emotionally needy guy who's being waited on hand and foot by slaves. There was an entire cultural divide that they weren't connecting on. So the point is, I never would have really talked about that culture. I wouldn't have had a character sit down and exposit and be like, my people believe. I was just gonna have her, like, be nice, but clearly not really liking this character, and him reaching out to her and trying to connect with her, but failing and not really getting why. The ending of that story was going to be that the character was going to go to a bar, and he was going to talk to people while they served him drinks, and he was going to realize that, like, oh hey, they've got these needs and this stuff that's going on. And then he was going to negotiate a steel deal on the basis that the queen would see to the needs of these people. Then this girl he was pining after would kind of realize, like, oh, maybe he doesn't suck. And then there would still just be this huge cultural chasm between them that isolates them from one another, but the audience could maybe feel like, hey, something could come out of it possibly, and you would maybe want to see this character come back and see if maybe the main character and this like female interest would do something. And what I'm describing to you is the first draft. This show did not actually go anywhere or take off, so it's never going to materialize. But I'll tell you though, if it had happened, that being the first draft, I was willing, and this is really important. As a writer, you must always be willing to kill your darlings. So I spent all this time building this stuff up, but if we had looked at it and by the second or third draft it still wasn't there, and these characters weren't fun and it wasn't a fun story, we would have thrown it away. All that writing would have been to waste, it wouldn't have mattered, but, if it's not fun for the viewer, there's no point. And that's part of the time process, the investing to make things good, is that you might build up a lot of material and do a lot of writing and spend a lot of time, and then just not be there, and you've got to throw it away and start over, back to the drawing board. This can lead into the issue where you never really get anything done, perhaps because you were never onto anything in the first place, or maybe because you're overly perfectionist about stuff. But I will say that's one really nice thing about having something like an editor. A lot of indie projects don't have an editor, but if you can submit something to an editor, then they will read this thing with fresh eyes, and they'll say, this grabbed me, this didn't, or this isn't working at all, let's forget about this, what else do you have? An editor is great. Do not underestimate the value of a good editor. Of course, it is important to get an editor who can actually write. Because a editor who doesn't know how to read or write, if you just oh, the animator is my editor, and your animator isn't a good writer, then all the editing they do is just gonna make the story worse. People talk about how indie projects are so great, and it is kind of nice because you see things that you might not normally see from industry work, but there is a reason why a lot of industry standards became standards. You should learn from some of that stuff and approach it and appreciate it. Spend your time wisely. Assume your first 30 seconds is the only time you're going to have with the audience. Don't spend a bunch of time farting around with characters, even if you're a good character writer, because you don't know that the audience is going to stick around to see the next episode. If you have time and you know a friend who is a good writer, run your scripts by them. And then let them be brutal with you. Let them tell you to give up on your dreams, because maybe you should. Look, if you're a creative person, you'll come up with new ideas. Your baby might seem precious to you now, but if someone else isn't seeing it, well, maybe you can circle back to that baby some other time. You've had a little bit more experience, you've had more time to think about it. When I think about one of my projects, like Jim of the Romantic Journey, circling back after all these years, I'm not sure how I could make that into something that would work. I think it just didn't have the pieces. But then some of my other old ideas, they just needed a little bit more workshopping. If only I could afford to do it. It all costs time on top of everything else. So there's a lot. It's tough. It's so hard. And when I criticize the Amazing Digital Circus or Monkey Wrench or whatever, I'm not saying these are fools and they should clearly see how to do things better. It is much easier to look at a finished project and then start to pick it apart than it is to build it from the ground up. I have no idea what was going on internally. Does the Amazing Digital Circus have an editor? Did Monkey Wrench have an editor? If so, why were the ideas not workshopped more? Were they kind of looking to hit a deadline? Because, if they're just trying to hit that deadline, I could see why maybe they would release and it wouldn't quite be there. You can't take forever. When I talk about writing all this background just so I can get into the head of a character, that was all writing I was not billing for that time spent. If I had been, they probably would have asked me to stop and just move on because it costs a lot. I also wasn't given a clear deadline. The project got canceled, so technically the time between now and when it's going to be released is infinity. So I could just keep on workshopping it forever if I wanted. But hey, that would not fly if I were brought on a project that was we gotta have this Monday. So anyway, bottom line, I strongly recommend doing multiple drafts, run things through an editor, someone who you trust and who you know is a good writer. Don't fall into this algorithm stuff. This company is not your friend. It is a hostile relationship. Walk away from ideas that aren't working, be willing to give up, but without totally giving up. Move on to the next thing. Figure out, why does your audience want to see the next episode? And then express that to them. If someone tells you, like, hey, it's okay to not have clear characterization, we're only 3 or 4 or 5 episodes in, catapult that person into the sun because they're not helping you. That's a problem, and if you're succeeding in spite of that, you're succeeding in spite of a problem. Try to avoid that kind of problem. If you can take the time, then flesh everything out, build your mythologies, draw your world maps, but remember, if your story is about Bilbo, your story is about Bilbo. The audience doesn't need to hear about Morgoth or the elves or the dwarves unless they're interacting with one of those set pieces. And even then, most people are not scholars. They're not going to tell you the factual history of the dwarves, they're going to tell you what they feel about the dwarves. And those feelings are informed by all that mythology that you wrote, but your characters aren't going to know all that mythology. That does mean that your audience is not going to hear the mythology. That's fine. If they want to know about it, you can release it as supplemental material. You know, be like, oh, do you want to see the pitch Bible or whatever that had all this background in it? Here you go. The nerds who loved your work enough to want that stuff will look into it. Usually, though, that's not the core material. I hate seeing indie projects that open up with like, oh, back in the day, the gods. It's no, like don't start telling me don't start with the Silmarillion. Start with Bilbo. So all this is kind of generalized advice. I think if you've really looked into writing, you've probably heard this before. In my experience, it is good advice, just on the general whole. That editor is where you'll get much more specific advice, and if they can give you specific advice, that is criticism, harsh criticism, such as like, I'm really not getting a sense of who Kinger is, or Jax doesn't seem to be anybody, that's good. Because it means that there's actionable advice that you can work on, and there might be something there. If an editor looks at it and they're just like, I don't really see it, then it might be a wash. You might just have to give up on the whole project. And I do see that with indie stuff. People will do Kickstarters and spend thousands of dollars and finish the thing, and you'll watch it, and it's just like, there's nothing there. The author clearly believed that these characters were lovable, but that's because it's their baby, and you love your own baby. A third party who you could trust, who would be harsh with you, might look at this and just say, like, this is nothing. The plot is nothing, the characters are nothing, there's nothing. So hey, something like work on the characters, a little workshopping, you'll get there. With Jim of the Romantic Journey, for example, I feel like in hindsight, you really just say, like, I'm not seeing a hook. I don't see the plot. Like, why do I watch the next episode? And that's really bad. And also why I haven't had a lot of, like, really highly focused, tailored criticism of my own show in this is because, at the end of the day, the biggest problem it faced was that there just was not a hook. And if there's not a hook, you've got to rewrite the whole show from the ground up. It would take an important critical question, like, what are you trying to do? Like, is this a slice of life thing? And if it is, I should have gone back and I maybe should have had focus on Dell's, like, romantic life and on the money and on stuff like that. Things that would be like, here's the conflict in Dell's life that the audience cares about, and they want to see if in the next episode he overcomes that on some level. It doesn't have to be heavy. I mean, if you think about, for example, Garfield, it's notoriously one of the least heavy plots out there, but I mean, you care about, is John ever going to get a date? Are Garfield and John going to have a single day where they get along with each other? It's not deep or sophisticated, but it is what it wants to be. Plenty of people will tell you that Garfield's not even all that good. So in theory, we should all be able to at least hit Garfield levels of writing. Like, don't have a higher budget than Garfield, but less going on than Garfield. It's, as I say, difficult, subjective, and in spite of what people say about it, creative work, it is a technical career. It's just that it's so much harder to judge than a lot of other things. It's less mathematical, it's more feelings-based, and the problem is that you have a lot of feelings about your own work. Knowing how to juggle that stuff, it's very up to the individual, you know, and some people can be crippled by too much self-criticism, and other people probably need a whole lot more self-criticism. So finding a balance is even difficult. But anyway, though, on a closing note, I suppose I'll say that I have regretted doing the forest episodes with Chloe, Gus, and Nico, because those were two low-energy characters, and then you had this, like, pacifistic do-nothing. That was such a terrible choice. I don't know why I did that. Good luck, everybody! Just keep at it!